You feel it before you even open your wallet. The rent notice that makes your heart sink. The utility bill that went from manageable to crushing. The trip to the store where your cart costs double what it did 2 years ago. Right now, millions of Americans are getting up, going to work, enduring brutal commutes, and still whispering the same desperate question to themselves. These aren't sensationalized headlines or cherry picked examples, they're real stories. A young professional who deposits money into savings each paycheck, only to withdraw it days later for basic necessities. A father working 7 days straight, spending 5 hours daily in traffic to reach his job, admitting he can't remember the last time he did something just for himself. Households opening $400 electric bills and wondering where they went wrong. And here's the reality: they didn't go wrong anywhere. Because if you've ever searched, why is everything unaffordable or cost of living crisis America online, you already understand what's unfolding. Incomes aren't rising with expenses, basic necessities cost more every month, and the distance between barely surviving and actually living keeps expanding. This video isn't just about statistics, it's about the human experience hidden inside those numbers. It's about understanding why basic survival feels so expensive, how we arrived at this breaking point, and what it means for regular Americans who feel like they're sprinting just to stand still. Stay with me until the end, because recognizing how the system works is the first step toward not being destroyed by it. The first thing that stands out when you listen to younger Americans discuss money isn't entitlement, laziness, or unreasonable demands. It's exhaustion, not the physical tiredness from one long shift, but the bone-deep weariness that comes from battling a system that grows more oppressive each year. In one exchange that really stuck with me, a woman in her 20s responds to older people telling her to simply work harder like they did decades ago. Her response is direct and angry. The rules changed. You broke the economy. Behind that frustration lies something more profound. The recognition that the economic playbook her parents followed no longer exists. And she's absolutely correct about one thing: the financial landscape has transformed in ways previous generations never had to navigate. In the late 70s and 80s, income and housing costs still tracked relatively together. You could purchase property in your 20s without requiring a six-figure salary or 10 years of accumulated savings. A college education didn't mean shouldering debt that haunts you into your 40s. Healthcare expenses, childcare costs, vehicle payments, all of them consume far less of your income. Today, when you adjust for inflation, the typical worker earns approximately what a worker earned in 1979. Meanwhile, the fundamental costs of existence have surged by over 70%. This isn't about pointing fingers at any particular generation. It's about acknowledging that America's economic foundation has fundamentally shifted. Cheap credit and rock-bottom interest rates inflated asset values for decades, sending home prices and investment returns into the stratosphere. Corporate consolidation means a handful of massive companies now control most of the essentials we cannot live without: groceries, utilities, healthcare. When just a few players dominate entire markets, prices don't simply increase. They stay elevated regardless of how much families are struggling. And while previous generations often supported entire households on one full-time income, younger generations face an economy where even dual incomes barely cover monthly obligations. The result is a form of economic whiplash. People are instructed to follow the same path their parents walked: work hard, save regularly, make responsible choices. But the mathematics no longer support that promise. The price of admission into middle-class stability has climbed faster than wages, faster than opportunities, and faster than realistic expectations. So when young people push back and insist it's not the same, they're not seeking pity. They're demanding honesty. Would you agree that today's American economy extracts more effort for less security than it did a generation ago? For millions of Americans, the housing crisis isn't some abstract economic indicator or cable news debate topic. It's sitting in your vehicle after a 12-hour shift wondering how you'll cover next month's rent. One woman in Arizona captures this reality perfectly. She pays $1,400 in rent, $700 for her car payment, $350 for insurance, plus utilities, groceries, and everything else that keeps piling up. Her voice breaks when she says, "I'm choosing between eating and paying bills, and even then I'm asking myself which bill gets paid late this month." That's not financial irresponsibility. That's housing costs accelerating far beyond what typical American paychecks can sustain. And the data confirms her experience. The median home price nationally hovers around $410,000 to $420,000, nearly 6 times the median household income. A ratio that used to sit at 3 to 1 has doubled within a single generation, transforming home ownership into something requiring extraordinary luck alongside hard work. Even renting, which historically served as the affordable option, has become its own impossible challenge. A standard one-bedroom apartment now averages roughly $1,500 monthly nationwide, lower than the 2022 peak, certainly, but still approximately 15% higher than pre-pandemic levels. In major metros like Seattle, Denver, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles, that same one-bedroom easily reaches $2,500 to $3,000 monthly. Housing hasn't cooled down. It's simply settled into a new, permanently expensive baseline. Why is this happening? It's not a single cause. It's multiple failures converging simultaneously. For years, America failed to construct enough housing to meet population demand. Construction activity slowed dramatically after the 2008 financial collapse and never fully recovered. Simultaneously, mortgage rates climbed from historic lows to 6 and 7%, effectively locking out first-time buyers. Investors, ranging from individual property owners to enormous institutional funds, swept in and purchased hundreds of thousands of homes, converting starter properties into permanent rental inventory. In states like Arizona and Louisiana, property insurance has exploded due to climate-related risks, pushing monthly ownership costs even higher. When shelter becomes both scarce and expensive, there's zero pressure for prices to decline. Families are forced into bidding wars, and competition drives prices up further. The consequences aren't merely financial, they're generational. The average first-time homebuyer is now in their mid-30s, the oldest age ever documented. Renting has transformed from a temporary phase into a permanent condition for many. Without home equity, wealth inequality expands. People feel trapped not because they refuse to work hard, but because the doors to stability are bolted shut by rising costs and vanishing options. And even for those who somehow manage to secure housing, the challenges don't stop there. Because once you have the keys, an entirely new category of bills arrives. Bills that frequently hit harder than the rent itself. Let's discuss those hidden expenses next. For many Americans, the real shock doesn't come from rent or mortgage payments. It comes from everything layered on top. The unavoidable bills, the ones you don't even consider until they arrive in your mailbox and trigger immediate panic. One woman recently posted her electricity bills from a brutal summer in Arizona. $570 for June, $690 for July, with projections showing August pushing her past $2,000 for just 3 months. She wasn't operating a mansion. She wasn't carelessly wasting energy. She wasn't living extravagantly. She was cutting every possible corner, preparing meals at home, eliminating unnecessary expenses, and it still wasn't enough. And while her situation represents an extreme example, it reflects a nationwide pattern. Officially, the average electric bill sits around $150 monthly, but that figure evaporates under real-world conditions. In regions experiencing extended heat waves, aging infrastructure, or constant air conditioning demand, $400 to $600 bills are routine during summer months. Water costs have jumped dramatically across major metropolitan areas. Internet access is now virtually mandatory for modern life. Car insurance premiums have spiked across the country. Individually, each increase seems manageable. Combined, they create what essentially becomes a second rent payment. Then there's the cost of getting to work. A man described his daily reality, driving nearly 4 hours every single day, working 6 days weekly, and realizing he no longer possesses the time or money for the basic things that bring him joy. He's not exaggerating. Vehicle payment data tells the same story. The average monthly payment for a new car now exceeds $700, with many drivers paying over $1,000. Used vehicles aren't cheap anymore either. And between insurance, fuel, maintenance, and rising interest rates, transportation has become one of the largest financial drains on typical households. But the deeper problem isn't just expense, it's necessity. Most Americans lack reliable public transportation. They cannot choose to go without a vehicle the way people in dense urban centers or other developed countries can. Employment is often far from residential areas, and remote work options don't exist for millions of occupations. The commute trap reinforces a vicious cycle. You need a car to generate income, but a massive portion of that income flows directly back into the car. All of this accumulates into a feeling countless people quietly experience. That existence has become an endless series of non negotiable expenses tied to simply being alive. Not luxuries, not upgrades, just survival. And when even those fundamentals stretch budgets to breaking points, the next place people turn is the one expense they absolutely cannot eliminate: food. The grocery aisle is where many people finally confront how precarious things have become, and that's where we're heading next. If there's one location where the cost of living crisis touches every single American, it's the supermarket. You can negotiate rent, postpone a car repair, cancel a vacation, eliminate streaming subscriptions, but you cannot stop eating. And that's precisely why so many people are hemorrhaging money in the aisles of Target, Kroger, Trader Joe's, and neighborhood grocery stores. One young woman articulated it perfectly when she explained her savings routine. She tries setting money aside every time she receives a paycheck. She transfers a little, promises herself she won't touch it, and then 48 hours later, she's withdrawing it again. Not for luxuries, not for impulse purchases, for food, for gas, for the basics necessary to survive the next 2 weeks. Every time I deposit money into savings, she says, I end up pulling it back out for something essential. That's not poor financial planning. That's evidence the essentials themselves have become unaffordable. The statistics tell an identical story. According to current government food cost estimates, a single adult today typically spends between $300 and $400 monthly on groceries, depending on location and dietary choices. And even after the pandemic era price spikes, costs continue rising approximately 2 to 3% annually. The painful reality is that food inflation never actually reversed. It merely decelerated while remaining at an elevated baseline, which means every paycheck purchases slightly less than it did 12 months earlier. But it's not only about price, it's about access to quality food. In numerous neighborhoods nationwide, particularly low-income and rural communities, major grocery stores have shut down or consolidated, creating food deserts. These are areas where residents must rely on convenience stores, dollar stores, or fast food restaurants because there's no real supermarket within reasonable distance. Fresh produce becomes harder to locate and more expensive when available. Meanwhile, heavily processed foods remain cheap and accessible. The economic outcome is predictable. Families attempting to stretch limited dollars end up purchasing what's affordable, not what's nutritious. This creates a hidden cost most Americans experience but rarely discuss openly. Eating cheaply today can mean paying significantly more later through elevated medical expenses, reduced energy levels, and compounding stress with every difficult financial decision. Parents reduce portion sizes, skip meals themselves, or substitute fresh ingredients with shelf-stable alternatives because the mathematics demand it. The grocery bill transforms from a source of nourishment into a source of anxiety. And when even the most fundamental necessity feels like a financial burden, many people ask themselves the same agonizing question. If purchasing food is this difficult, what realistic chance do I have with everything else? That sense of falling behind doesn't disappear at checkout. It follows people home and manifests in their bills, their credit card balances, and the debt they accumulate month after month. That brings us to the next critical piece: the expanding reliance on credit just to remain afloat. For an increasing number of Americans, basic survival is no longer funded with available cash. It's financed, not because people are pursuing luxuries, but because the fundamental cost of living has exceeded what their paychecks can realistically cover. One of the clearest illustrations comes from a content creator who detailed her monthly expenses: rent, electricity, water, car payment, car insurance, groceries, fuel. Then she posed the question countless families silently ask themselves at kitchen tables: which one of these can I skip this month and attempt to catch up on later? That's not irresponsible money management. That's a system where income and expenses have become fundamentally misaligned. Credit cards step in as the buffer, but they arrive with a steep price. Over the past year, American households have driven total credit card debt above $1,200,000,000,000, the highest level ever recorded. The average interest rate now exceeds 22%, which means any balance carried month to month grows faster than most people can realistically pay down. A $5,000 balance can easily balloon into thousands more in interest charges alone if someone can only afford minimum payments. And the vast majority of people carrying these balances aren't doing it for vacations or electronics. Research shows nearly half of cardholders use credit cards to cover essentials: groceries, gaps in rent, utility bills, unexpected vehicle repairs. Medical expenses only compound the problem. Even with insurance coverage, high deductibles and out-of-pocket costs push families into using credit cards just to access routine care. Emergency room visits, specialist consultations, prescription medications, none of it waits for someone to accumulate savings. Health problems don't pause for inflation, and when a bill arrives before a paycheck, the credit card becomes the only available option. Over time, these patterns create a quiet rhythm. Debt becomes normalized. Interest charges become expected. Financial breathing room vanishes completely. Simultaneously, wages have failed to keep pace. When earnings stagnate while prices escalate, debt fills the gap. It becomes a tool people depend on, not by choice, but by necessity. It's a bridge between the life someone is working toward and the life they can currently afford. But it's also a trap, because every month that balance increases, the financial pressure intensifies for millions already struggling. What makes this even more psychologically damaging is the emotional burden. People understand they're doing their best. They're budgeting carefully, eliminating expenses, doing everything possible to stay responsible, yet the mathematics still force them into relying on borrowed money. And with each transaction, the feeling of falling behind grows stronger. If the fundamentals of existence require financing, what happens to a person's sense of stability, their confidence, their long-term aspirations? And how does this relentless pressure reshape how Americans envision their futures? That leads us directly into the final element of this picture: the toll all of this exacts on mental well-being and the fading promise of the American dream. When you listen to Americans discuss the rising cost of living, there's a moment when the conversation stops being about finances and becomes something far heavier. It's the point where people admit they're exhausted in a way that rest cannot fix, tired of working endless hours, tired of racing against mounting bills, tired of feeling like progress remains perpetually just out of reach. One creator captured his reality: 6 days weekly at work, nearly 4 hours of daily commuting, with zero time or energy remaining for the simple activities he enjoys. He wasn't seeking sympathy. He was trying to make sense of a life where effort and outcomes no longer correlate, and that experience isn't unusual. Research indicates that a majority of Americans report experiencing financial stress on a daily basis. Rising rent, volatile utility costs, accumulating debt, and pressure to keep up create a sensation of constant strain. Even when people do everything correctly, budget meticulously, work extra shifts, eliminate non-essential spending, they still feel like the foundation is shifting beneath them. This isn't about individual failure. It's about existing in an economy where the cost of stability has climbed faster than most people's capacity to afford it. The emotional impact is genuine and measurable. Financial pressure affects relationships, family dynamics, and long term planning. Parents worry about adequately providing for their children. Young adults question whether they'll ever afford home ownership. Workers wonder if they'll ever reach a point where they're not constantly catching up. People begin to feel disconnected from the future they envisioned because the pathway toward it keeps narrowing. This is where the concept of the American dream enters the conversation, not as nostalgia, but as a metric for how expectations have transformed. For decades, the promise was straightforward: work hard, make responsible decisions, and life will progressively improve. That promise feels increasingly fragile now. Home ownership gets delayed by a decade. Savings accounts don't accumulate fast enough to match rising expenses. Economic mobility, the belief that each generation will surpass the previous one, has slowed dramatically. People aren't abandoning ambition. They're encountering barriers previous generations never faced. Yet, even with these obstacles, many Americans still cling to something important: the belief that life shouldn't merely be about getting by. They want time with family, space to breathe, the ability to plan for the future. Not perfection, just stability. That desire itself is evidence that hope hasn't vanished. It has simply become harder to access under the weight of today's economy. Which brings us to the final question. If the system feels this oppressive, what can people extract from understanding it? And how do we make sense of a future where the cost of living continues rising faster than the opportunities designed to support it? Let's bring everything together in the conclusion. When you step back and examine everything collectively, the housing squeeze, the escalating utility expenses, the grocery store sticker shock, the reliance on credit, and the pressure it places on people, it becomes evident this isn't merely an economic narrative, it's a human one. The cost of living in America 2025 isn't measured exclusively in dollars, it's measured in stress, in time lost, in dreams people keep postponing because covering the basics consumes so much of them. But understanding the system doesn't mean accepting it passively. It means recognizing that these pressures aren't personal failures. They're structural obstacles that millions are confronting simultaneously. The real question now is, which aspect of this reality feels closest to your experience? Housing, food expenses, debt, or the sensation of running constantly just to stay level? And if this breakdown helped you understand why everything feels so unaffordable with greater clarity, hit subscribe and share this video, because no one should have to navigate this economy in isolation